bearing with us during the delay. For those of you who don't know the Economic Research Forum, it's the region's foremost economic research think tank. And if any of you know economists, you know that they tend to talk in terms of numbers. It's always numbers. Gross domestic product, inflation targeting, per capita income, it's always numbers. Never people, it's always numbers. So about a year ago, James Robinson and Diwan Zamalek wrote a book which was groundbreaking in many ways because it said it's not just about the numbers, it's not just about the figures, it's about people and it's about political institutions. You have a country with good political institutions, you have a rich country. Because the question that they asked was the question that people have been wondering about for eons. It's why are some countries rich and why are some countries poor? And it's not just natural resources, it's not just money, it's not just military power, it's really about the political institutions. Now, ERF is in the business of disseminating information to help development. And we thought that at the moment, in light of everything that was happening in the region, in light of everything that was happening in Egypt at the moment, this would be a good time to have someone talk about the importance of good political institutions for prosperity, for wealth, for stability, because this is why some countries do better than others. They have good, accountable political systems. And this is what we're all hoping will happen. This is what we're all waiting for, but this is what we need to see what will happen. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to the expert. I'm going to turn it over to James Robinson, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, so I'm going to try to talk about the book for a little bit, 20 minutes. The book's called Why Nations Fail, and it's jointly written with Diwan Zamalek, who's a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So I'm not going to. I have lots of slides, but I won't use very many of them. But let me just sort of show you a couple of figures just for fun. This is a bit distorted for some reason when it compiled. But what is this? Well, this is estimates of average living standards in different parts of the world, income per capita, and from 1,000 to 2,000. So I'm not going to tell you about these numbers very much. You could express more or less skepticism about individual estimates, but I just want to sort of mention a few things about this figure. So at one level, the book is trying to propose a simple theory thinking about differences in living standards today. So if I compare the difference between the poorest part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, or the richest part of the world, North America, Singapore, Japan, or whatever, Western Europe, then there'll be a difference of about 40. So average living standards are about 40 times greater in the richest part of the world compared to the poorest part of the world. But if I went back in time, historically, I went back to the start of the early modern period, those differences are much smaller. So two big things happened over the last 200, 300 years. Average living standards in the world got increased, but also an enormous amount of inequality appeared. So why do I emphasize this historical aspect of this? Well, two reasons. One, I won't sort of get into at all in this talk, which is that thinking about the historical dynamics of economies is very powerful as a way of discriminating between different theories about why some economies do well and others don't do well. But also I want to emphasize the dynamics because this suggests that the world changed a lot in the last 250, 300 years. And the theory is about what changed in order for this process to be sort of unleashed. There's also lots of theories about comparative economic development, as you can imagine, and the book discusses quite a few of those, but I'm not going to talk about those either. I'm just going to talk about what we did. Okay? So what does a theory look like that can explain these very large differences in living standards today and how they emerged historically? Well, to motivate the theory, let me show you a photograph. And this is this photograph. This is the Korean Peninsula at night. Okay, so here's South Korea. This is the border, the demilitarized zone, and this is Seoul. And there's North Korea. So there's a startling difference between South Korea and North Korea, which is that North Korea doesn't have any electricity. I guess this is probably the presidential compound in Pyongyang. They have a few generators there because the president likes kind of fancy electronic gadgets, so he needs electricity for that and to keep his whiskey at the right temperature. But this is a huge distinction between North Korea and South Korea. Now, what's interesting about this, so this measures all sorts of things. It measures vast differences in living standards between South Korea and North Korea, and it measures vast differences in public good provision and other things. But why is this example interesting? So this is an example which is similar to many examples we use in the book to sort of kind of illustrate the point in a very stark way, which is that if I went back 50, 60 years ago, that difference wouldn't exist at all. In fact, before the Korean War, if anything, North Korea was richer than South Korea. Most of the industry that the Japanese developed was actually in North Korea, not in South Korea, because North Korea was where the iron ore and the coal was. This enormous difference appeared over the past 50, 60 years. So why did this difference appear? Now, you could have lots of different theories about that. You could say, well, isn't that because they had communism in the north and they had capitalism in the south? And at some level, that's sort of correct, but that's not what our theory is about. Our theory is about the fact that aspects of the communist economy were very bad for economic development. But this book is not a book about why communism is bad and capitalism is good, because as I'll try to suggest, communism and the economic implications of communism is just a subset of a much more general syndrome that makes countries poor. And what is that syndrome? Well, it's the key to understanding that is the fact that in South Korea has an organization of the economy. I'm going to use a language to talk about the organization of the economy. I'm going to talk about the economic institutions of the economy. So by institutions, I mean rules that create incentives, constraints, incentivize people's behavior. South Korea had a structure of economic institutions which created incentives for people and gave them economic opportunities. North Korea had a system of economic institutions that created absolutely no incentives or no opportunities. So this was a society where, there was basically no private ownership of anything. There was no private economy except the black illegal economy. People couldn't own assets. Everything was collectively owned. When you left school, everyone had to go into the military for 10 years. There was recurrent famine. South Korea, what happened over the same period was South Korea, there was a huge expansion of education, became a very dynamic, innovative manufacturing economy. Okay, so I would argue that there's lots of details here, and there's lots of differences between North and South Korea and any other part of the world. But I'm going to argue that what's really significant about this is that in South Korea they set up economic institutions which gave people incentives and access to economic opportunities, and in North Korea they didn't. Okay? Why is that? Why is this significant? Well, let me go back to this first picture. And what really kind of jump-started this whole picture here was something which kind of creates this transition, this phase transition in Western European economic development in the 18th century and 19th century, is what's called the Industrial Revolution. What was the Industrial Revolution? That was the kind of start of modern economic growth, of new technologies, improvements in productivity. It started with mechanization of production, new sources of transportation, power, the steam engine, the railway, the factory system, new methods of organizing production, which enormously increased economic efficiency. That led to a second economic industrial revolution in the 19th century, petrochemicals, electricity, and that's gone on and on. So it was a wave of innovation which accumulated over time. And in some sense, thinking about the picture today of inequality in the world, what explains that inequality in the world is that all of these innovations and productivity enhancing creations that started with the Industrial Revolution, they accumulated in some parts of the world, but even basic parts of them haven't spread to other parts of the world. Electricity's been around for almost 150 years. That hasn't reached North Korea yet. If I showed you a map of sub-Saharan Africa at night, you'd see the same thing. Okay? I've been doing a lot of research in Sierra Leone in West Africa over the last 6 or 7 years. The first time I went to Sierra Leone in 2007, there was absolutely no light, publicly provided electricity in the entire country. If you had a generator, you could run some light bulbs in your house, but there was no electricity other than that. So some basic technologies, well understood, don't spread. So this industrial revolution that starts this process and this uneven dissemination, why does it start in some places and why doesn't it disseminate to other places? Why did it disseminate and even accumulate in South Korea and not in North Korea? Well, that's because of this structure of economic institutions. Okay? So we have a language for that in the book, and we call this, we say, what's crucial about understanding how the British Industrial Revolution emerged in Britain in the 18th century is that in Britain they developed what we call inclusive economic institutions. And I'm not going to get into details here, but let me emphasize this notion of inclusive economic institutions, where that terminology comes from and why it's important. Go back to the British Industrial Revolution. British Industrial Revolution, it was about innovation. So let me ask the question, who was doing the innovation? Okay, who was inventing the steam engine and the railway and tarmac and the factory system and the mechanizing? Who came up with the idea of how to mechanize weaving or spinning and stuff? Was that King George I? Was it the Duke of Norfolk? Was it some kind of elite? Or no, it wasn't elites. It was non-elites. It was people from all over the social spectrum. It was elites, non-elites, poor people, rich people, farmers, artisans. So the idea of inclusion, and what you get from studying this process of Industrial Revolution, for example, where it's very well documented, is ideas, skills, talent, creativity is very broadly spread in society. So if you want to have innovation and economic growth, you need to have a set of institutions that will harness all of that talent and energy and ideas and skills. And that's what Britain developed in the 18th century. That's what South Korea had that North Korea didn't. And we call those inclusive economic institutions. What North Korea has is, not socialist economic institutions, or maybe at some level it does, but we're going to call that much more fundamentally extractive economic institutions. So extractive economic institutions are the sort of antithesis of inclusive economic institutions. They're sets of economic institutions that don't incentivize people or don't create opportunities. Okay? So the basic story about economic dynamics is that there's these different sets of economic institutions underlying success and failure. So where did those things come from? Was that some clever, Harvard economist who came up with one idea and the South Koreans managed to hire him, but the North Koreans hired some loser economic advisor who came up with the wrong plan? No. This book is not about ideas, it's about politics. So what lies behind different sets of economic institutions are different types of politics. So to create inclusive economic institutions, it's not a matter of having good advisors, or some particular culture, or being far from the equator, or whatever it is. It's about having particular sets of political institutions that create the politics that lead to inclusive economic institutions. Okay? So let me just illustrate that. I usually illustrate that with one example, which is apartheid South Africa. So apartheid South Africa, which disappeared in 1994, was what was apartheid South Africa? It was like many colonial societies. It was organized for the benefit of a small elite, in this case white, at the expense of the vast mass of the population. Okay? What did economic institutions look like? Well, I could describe lots of different economic institutions in South Africa. Let me just talk about a few. In 1913, the country was divided up, and 93% was the white economy. The whites were about 20% of the population. They got 93% of the land, including nearly all the best land. And black people got 7%. In the labour market, a bunch of regulations were introduced. There was a law called the colour bar. What did the colour bar do? The colour bar specified a vast list of occupations that only white people could occupy. Any skilled or professional job a black person couldn't do. What could black people do? Well, they couldn't own assets or have a business in the white economy. So the only thing they could do was work as unskilled labourers in mines or farms. So this created a sort of very, very poor black 80% of the population and a very rich white 20% of the population. It created possibly the world's most unequal society. And these institutions, economic institutions, are exactly extractive in the sense that they blocked the economic opportunities and incentives for the vast mass of the population in society, but they were very attractive for white people. And this is how colonial Latin America was set up. It was how Zimbabwe, Namibia, many parts of the world were set up.